Welcome to this ICAS webinar focused on well-being and professional judgment, supporting ethical decision-making in practice. Now, why are we having this conversation today? And I think you would agree that whether it's professional judgment or well-being, they are important subjects, whether together or separately. And why are we talking about it today? Well, this week is Mental Health Awareness Week in the UK, and this theme is taking action. And Mental Health Awareness Week is led by the Mental Health Foundation, and the campaign really highlights that whilst awareness is vital, real changes and real action is important. And that is what we're here to talk about today within the context of accountants and professional judgment. Well, for those who do not know me, I'm Johnny Jacobs, and it's a real privilege to be the Deputy President of ICAS. I've been an ICAS member for many years, having trained with KPMG, and spent the last 20 years holding senior finance and non-finance roles for major international brands. But it's also been a privilege to sit on various charity boards, and one of those was the Mental Health Foundation, and it's a subject that's deeply important to me. And I'm delighted that we have two incredible leaders with us. And firstly, we have the Chief Executive of the Mental Health Foundation with us today. Now, Mark Rowland was appointed to that position almost 8 years ago now, in 2018. And prior to that, Mark spent many years in international development, living in some fascinating places across Asia and Africa, and he speaks widely on the subject of mental health and how we're addressing the issue to make our lives more healthier in the UK. Now, Mark is a very busy man this week running Mental Health Awareness Week, so we are thrilled that he has chosen to spend some of his time with us today on this Friday afternoon. Now, also very pleased to have Mary Campbell, OBE CA, with us today. Now, Mary brings a huge amount of experience as an international corporate finance expert who spent decades serving on advisory boards. She trained at EY, qualified as a chartered accountant, and she's currently the course leader at the Institute of Directors on its international governance programme. And I think you'll find that what Mary will bring to the table today is hugely fascinating and very relevant to the topic. So look, we have an hour together whilst I will ask Mary and Mark some questions. I'd love to create a space for your questions, so please do send them in. We have a Q&A button at the top. Please do get them in. We want to make this interactive to create a meaningful conversation on how well-being influences our judgment, our behaviour, and our ethical decision-making. In terms of other bits of housekeeping before we get started, you've all been auto-muted. Like I say, please do use the Q&A function at the top. The webinar is also recorded. And just before I introduce Mark and Mary onto the screen, I do just want to say that naturally we may go into topics that are sensitive, that are challenging. So anything that is discussed today, if you feel impacted by it, please do either dial out the webinar, or we will share a helpline with you at the end of this, an email, along with the recording. So it's important that we're mindful of that. So I'd love now to welcome Mark and Mary onto the screen. Okay, welcome.
Thank you.
Right, Mark, I think we should start with you, given it's Mental Health Awareness Week, and you could perhaps set the scene for us. And when we spoke recently, one thing you said, which stuck out, is really we do see a deterioration in decision making if we are struggling from mental health. And I just wonder if that's a nice lead in to maybe share a bit more about Mental Health Awareness Week and why you think the audience should really stand up and take notice.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Happy Mental Health Awareness Week, and thank you, Johnny, for that introduction. It's fantastic to be here. For those of you who don't know, the Mental Health Foundation has been around for 75 years, and I've not been chief executive for all of that time, but have done the last 8 years, and we've been running Mental Health Awareness Week for about 25 years. So one of the things that we've seen over that time is an explosion in people wanting to talk about mental health, wanting to find spaces and places where they can describe the reality of their inner lives, where they can close the distance from how we present on the outside to what we feel on the inside. And Mental Health Awareness Week and mental health awareness more general, I think, Johnny, has just exploded because there's been this pent-up desire to want to know we're not alone. And it turns out that many of us do struggle in different ways more of the time than was ever expected. And I can talk about some of the latest findings that we found in terms of the prevalence of poor mental health, but it is legitimately rising in terms of the levels of psychological distress across the UK. And one of the things that we've been looking at this particular week, we wanted to take a focus on action, because there is what marketeers call a sort of say-do gap for many of us, and it works at individual level, it works at organizational level, and also in terms of government policy. There's a gap between what we know and what we know is good for us and what we're actually doing. And what we've saw from the data that we did for polling for Mental Health Awareness Week this year was that almost half of us, when we're under pressure, when we're feeling stressed, when we're feeling anxious, about 2/3 of us turn to do things that are actually harmful for our mental health and make our mental health worse rather than better. We tend to opt for short-term relief over long-term health, and that's a function of the fact that psychological distress is hard for us to bear. It's not easy, and we will sometimes choose the comfort over, and so things like doom scrolling or withdrawing or overeating or use of alcohol it was very common. So we can get into the discussion about ethics as well, because I think it's really important to say that people with poor mental health or experiencing mental illness, there's no evidence to suggest that they're more unethical than people who aren't, but it definitely does affect your capacity and your decision-making function, and being aware of that is a really key skill that people who have gone through periods of mental ill health actually bring into the workplace and are often really valuable for that experience.
Thank you, Mark. I think it's a really good intro and sets the scene really well for us. And perhaps I could come to you, Mary, now, because when we spoke earlier in the week, I was fascinated by tons of what you said. And one thing that really stuck out was your perspective on the recent scandals, and or even not so recent scandals, actually, and the impact that can have on those people who saw it and the ones who did speak are the ones that didn't speak. And I wondered if you might be able to share a bit more about that, and also generally your experience on this subject.
Yeah, I think it's my approach to the well-being and the mental health is not an area where I am a specialist. I have been a leader for a long time. I've been a member of ICAS for over 40 years. And I've looked at it much more in terms of, as a professional in a highly competitive environment, what's the impact on us of conflicting priorities? How do we serve the interests of organisations whilst at the same time protecting our own well-being? And the scandals bring that into really sharp focus. And I've been very heavily involved in commenting on the post office scandal, because that's a scandal that has gone on for my first experience in non-executive appointments was as a director of a company that had 12 sub-postmasters licenses. That's back in the 1990s. And that scandal had gone on for the best part of 40 years. With people, with thousands of professionals and tens of thousands of professionals knowing something wasn't right. And what's interesting when you look at the impact of that and the people involved, it's easy to see when people have been caused shame, distress, humiliation, but the impact of those who allowed that to happen who were there, who didn't speak up, who said nothing, many of whom moved out and took other jobs and left the problem behind them. But the truth is that when scandals get exposed, everyone feels uncomfortable about their role in not doing something. So I think we talk in professions and we talk in the training that we give with ICAS and the ethics training, and we refer people to Maya Angelou's work where she says courage is the most important virtue that any of us has because it's what underpins the foundation of all the other virtues, and ethics and these things. And I think the one thing I would ask people to focus on is speaking up is hard, but living with the consequences of not speaking up is also very difficult. And, so you're in a no-win situation, so you might as well choose the better of the two options. And a message to our fellow professionals out there. So it's a much more personal message for me of, look, I've seen a lot of this stuff over the decades. Be aware of the impact of your actions on yourself, as well as on the reputation of the organisations and institutes that you're members of.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mary. It's quite profound, isn't it? And some of the quotes there as well, I think are going to stick with the audience, will be some of the key takeaways, no doubt. And if we then think about, with that in mind, what does good workplace culture look like in a way that supports that sound, good professional judgment? So maybe come to you, Mark, first of all. What's your thoughts around and some of the practical things that our audience can also take away, either as individual contributors, as leaders? What does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, it was fascinating hearing Mary talk about that experience of the consequence of the kind of moral injury of watching something. If you want to live with good mental health, my definition in psychological terms, we call it congruence, right? And congruence is when you can bring what you believe and what you value in line with how you're living and how you behave. And that brings a real inner sense of fulfillment if you can do that. And I think that's why when you're put in situations where there is something that, I mean, and we find this all the time, Johnny. I mean, it's startling the amount of psychological distress in the workplace that happens because of the dissonance between how the entity is behaving and the individual's values. And a lot of people are either hiding in the workplace or leaving the workplace because they're refusing to let go of their values. And so it's a really key area. And I think, to me, what good looks like is, we talk about the 3 C's, right? You need, which we're broadly talking about psychological safety, aren't we? What you need for psychological safety is the ability for challenge, it's the ability for dissent, to be able to take a contrary view and for that to be heard and not penalised or not victimised. So challenge is really important. Are you seeing it? Is it possible? Is there clarity from the organisation about the rules of engagement? Because unless, clarity is kindness, as forget who said that, it will come to me. But I think clear boundaries about what is appropriate and what isn't, and what is expected of people. That social contract at the beginning is really, really important. And then that's got to be applied consistently and fairly. So it's challenge, clarity, consistency. And if there's obvious favoritism in the way that policy is implemented, or it's implemented for some and not for others, that will cause a real issue. And so I think, we really see from the evidence that the work of people like Amy Edmondson has done, that psychological safety is good for professional performance, it's good for corporate performance, it drives innovation, it drives learning. But also, on the flip side, you do need to know what is good and bad. It's not a free-for-all. Too much psychological safety is actually linked with poor performance, in terms of if you can just do whatever you want. So clarity, consistency, and for a healthy culture, and where people know what's expected and are able to work creatively within that.
Thank you, Mark. And it's worthwhile just perhaps me just sharing. A number of years ago, you very kindly came into an organisation where I was leading a finance team. It was one of the most important moments where you helped educate actually the audience what psychological safety was. And the reality is I didn't know a huge amount about it back then. And now I never stop quoting it because I think it's fundamental. And when you look at the work, and it's often quoted for those people on the call, the work of Google's Project Aristotle that analysed 180 teams, and they demonstrated that performance, if you get the right level of psychological safety, performance is linked to that. And they could demonstrate that it could drive productivity, innovation, growth up off the back. And I think if we're certainly as finance people or accountants in the audience, we're better if you can create a purpose and a psychological safety aligned to your culture that also drives performance as well. I think that's a really interesting point to take away that you make there, Mark. So, Mary, I wonder what's your perspective on psychological safety and what role could we play?
A little bit like you, Johnny, psychological safety wasn't a term that I was familiar with actually until the pandemic. And during the pandemic, I was reading all the things from the big business schools, the big four, this is how it is out there. And I thought, that's not according. There's just a dissonance there between what I'm experiencing with clients and what I'm hearing from people who were selling solutions for things. So we had what we called a large conversation with over 1,500 directors and just asked them open questions. How is it for you at the moment? What are your priorities? Where are you feeling the stretch? What's of major concern to you? And we ran the survey for 3 years. So over the first year of the pandemic and then the following 2 years. And I had chartered psychologists come and look at the data and so forth, because I'm not, you started to get into the psychological area and I say, hey, I'm an accountant, I know psychology is very important. I know personal well-being is very important, but I'm not equipped to analyze this data. And what was really interesting from a survey that was just about what was happening in boardrooms was that the psychologists came back and pointed to the very strong correlation between people who were reporting improved performance and people who were reporting that it was okay to dissent, that they were in the things that gave evidence of being in a psychologically safe environment. So you were asking about conflicting priorities, we were asking more about and we deliberately didn't use the word conflict. We used the word diffuse decisions, how are things looking? So it was very interesting for me that the psychologist came back for something that for them was looking at accountants data, boardroom data, to say, actually, this is real evidence that these two things in all sizes of organizations, small organizations, large organizations, in crisis times, they perform much better when people are able to dissent, to speak safely, to challenge, to give alternative views. And that's in line with what you hear from the work of Bob Garrett, the work of Daniel Kahneman, these people talking about bias and dispersed thinking and so forth. So I think for us as accountants, it behoves us to really learn to listen and to ask others what they see in the data that's coming forward.
Yeah. I was just going to jump in there as well and say, I don't know if you've seen the, I think it's the Global Workplace Happiness Report that's come out last month. 1.9 million data points on employee well-being and happiness in the workplace. And the points that they make, and I think it's underrated, is that business resilience is downstream of employees' resilience. So, and psychological safety is really important for that. Safety is such an important psychological concept. We are so wired to our brains are really effective threat detectors. So we are absolutely wired biologically and evolutionary to be able to notice that. And so much of the time we get it wrong. So much of the time we detect threats that are not real. And a lot of Montaigne is saying, he has the philosopher Montaigne had this famous quote. He said, "I've lived through many tragedies in my life, most of which never happened." And many of us do that. We live our lives in imagined suffering. And so if employers can understand human psychology and understand that we so often imagine that someone see a raised eyebrow and says that person thinks I'm terrible, but that's why the line management, the relationship, the way that you do accountancy and performance, accountability and performance is really important. If you can reduce the uncertainty, if you can signal safety when it is genuinely safe, you can then free people up to be who able to offer their gifts, offer their ideas, and you can really see a correlation between innovation, imagination, creativity, and safety. Now, I don't know. I'm not in the accountancy profession. I don't know how much creativity is needed. You might say you don't want creative accountancy, but actually you do want people going into their workplace feeling as safe as possible, because they are not going to make as many mistakes. They're going to be able to share if they're worried about something. They're going to be able to say, "Look, I'm not sure. Can I check?" So I think, I suppose I go back to the starting point there as well, that I think psychological safety is a recipe for commercial success. But a bit like with mental health, businesses can often take a short-term profit motive over long-term business resilience, and I think in the end that trade-off is the wrong one, and actually going for a resilient organisation and in the long term is the better commercial as well as human strategic approach.
So if we accept the fact that there's clearly a benefit if we get this right, whether it's culturally, morally, commercially, as both of you have just clearly outlined, and if we also accept the fact that there have been lots of really quite stark examples where organisations have got this wrong, then I guess the question I'm asking, and maybe some of our audience might be asking, is what are the real signs? So I think it's a great quote that you mentioned there around a lot of it happens in your head, right? But what are the real signs which colleagues can look out for, and what can they then do about it to potentially improve the environment? So maybe come to you, Mary, first on that.
Yeah, I think Malcolm Gladwell and his outliers, and what are you seeing? I ask people to think, what would I have to believe that the story that I'm being told? What are the fundamentals of what I'm being told? So post office scandal, the system is robust with one or two anomalies. What would I have had to believe that was the case? I would have had to believe that the postmasters were happy with the system. I would have had to believe that we weren't prosecuting more and more people. And you say, what was the evidence? Where was the evidence that questions were being asked? And I think what we haven't touched on it yet, but I think what's the power of the group and holding people in place. And, we teach about having a clear purpose, a clear vision. That's very important. But if you start to drink the Kool-Aid and you start to say, I don't want to go into work on a Monday morning, I'm feeling stressed, pay real attention to what those signals are telling you. Pay real attention to what churn in your staff is telling you. Pay real attention to the other indicators that we get that say things are not as we might think they are here. So to look at the whole picture and say, does this all stack up? And pay particular attention to the things that don't stack up, because that can be the thread that if you unravel, that lets you see where the real underlying problem is, because the herd will cover the problem. It's just human psychology. And if you challenge the overwhelming weight of the group will close ranks round about what is seen to be the major message.
So what do we do about it? How do we act? Maybe one for you, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we said earlier on, the first, I'm a massive, I mean, I'm a massive believer in culture and leadership and role models. But in my experience, you start with the systems and policies and structures. Is there a process for whistleblowing? Are there checks and balances to executive power? So you don't put it all on the individuals. Like the system has to be geared to the fact that there are bad actors who will be willing to exploit the system, and can the systems and processes pick that up and flag it in a way that does, that supports those wanting to make the right decisions. So I think that is really important. In my own experience, I think being open about mistakes builds trust. It doesn't diffuse it. And this is the miscalculation that a lot of people make. It's not the mistake that causes the damage. It's what you do in response to that mistake. It's the cover up. It's all of the things that you do to embellish it. So I think if you're going to have the courage to be able to own mistakes, I don't think I've spoken publicly about this, but I made a decision regarding a change in payment terms in our staff, and we were reconfiguring how much we paid in pensions, and we were wanting to give people more money in their monthly pay packet and slightly reduce the generous pension offer that we had. But we had missed, as an executive team, we'd taken it to the board. This was not when you were on the board, Johnny, because you'd have got this, but we had missed that this needed a 60-day consultation with staff to change terms and conditions. And so we came to the staff, we came to the board and said, we've made a mistake, we're going to go back, we're going to open this up to consultation. And the engagement with staff was actually stronger as a result of us being able to hold our hands up, say we made a mistake, and the board felt more confident that as an executive team they could as a non-exec we could trust the executive, because we had come to them with a mistake that had been made and a plan of action to correct it. So I think those sorts of I think mistakes are opportunities to build trust. They're opportunities to show vulnerability. They're opportunities to show leadership and humanity. And I think people underestimate that they can actually be not comfortable, but good opportunities to demonstrate what a culture actually looks like. Can I just add on to that, because there are a few things the few watch outs that I would just add to what Mary said. How, in terms of a healthy culture, an overemphasis on the hero leader. I think if there's a cult of personality in your organization, that's something to watch out for. That makes dissent harder. If there's evidence of favoritism in an organization where certain people seem to get certain privileges without having to work as hard as others, that's a watch out, because that's an abuse of power. If there is a lack of if everything is deadly serious, if there's no play and no humour, humour is a very good proxy for safety, because there's a bit of a risk that you have to make in being playful. And so those are some of the cultural hallmarks. It doesn't mean that everything is terrible, but they're just some of the things that if it's deadly serious, there's a big hero worship. Basically, you don't want to be in a cult. A cult, they hero worship the leader. It's all deadly serious. There's no dissent, and you can't use humour because it's seen as undermining. So those are some of the things that I think are indicators.
Thank you, Mark. And if we, building what you've said, if we therefore accept the fact that having the right culture drives performance and also improves general decision making, ethical judgment, and a key part of that is the well-being of colleagues and staff that sit within it. I guess question first of all for Mary and Mark, maybe you could then also come in afterwards, is what do you think therefore organisations can be doing more to protect the well-being of their colleagues? If that's a keystone to all of this, what more can they be doing, and what more can we as ICAS members also be doing?
Yeah, I think if I look at ICAS and what I've seen it doing over the last 4 decades, Certainly there would have been absolutely no talk of mental well-being and so forth when I came into the profession in 1983. I think what I've seen with ICAS and the training that we give in ethics, and we make it quite clear. 20 years ago we started with the power of one, to say, look, one courageous voice can make a difference. Speak up for your own well-being, the well-being of others around you. I think the vocabulary that we're giving people now, students in particular, with the training in ethics, that says, look, we've got programs that help you articulate, is this something that I think is wrong in any circumstances? Is this something where I think the end justifies the means? How can we have these nuanced discussions? It's okay to have different viewpoints. In fact, we make better decisions when we hear lots of different viewpoints, or we might as well be sitting in a room full of mirrors. And it's one of the things we teach in governance, look, I've got to respectfully listen to views that I don't agree with, because there might be bits in there that will point me to alternative courses of action, alternative outcomes. And I think the other thing I would say, just based on particularly what Mark's saying and what I've seen from the scandals, is the shame that can come when people start to feel ashamed about working somewhere. When people start to feel ashamed about the job they're being asked to do, that is psychologically so damaging for us. So if you ever find yourself thinking, oh, I wish I wasn't there, try to deal with that as quickly as possible. And if it's going on within an organization, just keep trying to bring it to the attention, because I think within organizations, in my experience, people are genuinely trying to do the right thing. Nobody wants to be out there saying I'm part of something that is abusive or failure, or is using power to get my own way to everyone else's expense. We are all human beings. We generally like to be liked. We generally like to feel good about what we're doing. So you will find people will listen. It won't be easy, but you will find people who will listen. So just deal with it, because the consequences of not dealing with it are too great.
Yeah, I agree. Have you come across, I'm sure I've talked to you about this, Johnny, but Kim Scott's model around radical candor?
Yeah.
Because I find that really useful. It's a sort of two axis, and on one axis is how direct am I going to be? Very direct, or I'm not going to tell the truth. So tell the truth, not tell the truth. The other axis is I care about you, I don't really care about you. And Kim Scott's view is that many organizations end up in what she calls ruinous empathy. And that is, I care about you, but I'm not going to tell the truth. And so you end up with a culture where you get people talking behind people's backs, or they walk. The analogy is sort of someone walking around with a stain on their shirt, but nobody says. The box you want to be in terms of healthy culture is I care about you and I'm going to tell the truth, and that's what she calls radical candor. And I think that's an incredibly liberating. I think you can bake that into, you can set that out in terms of your policies, in terms of your line manager training, that's the expectation, that you're going to have a high accountability, high trust culture. You're not going to treat people like children. You're going to give people responsibility, but you will tell the truth in the context of saying, I really value you as a colleague. And so, I think that's an overarching kind of model that we've used, and it has played real dividends for us in terms of people being able to come forward when they feel that they've been mistreated, or they've had a tough time, or they just need some support. But more broadly, Johnny, I think there are three dimensions to workplace well-being, which are not just about having a really effective EAP. They're about how clear is the job you're being asked to do. What does job design look like? That's a fundamental. How much security is there in your job? So occupational uncertainty, the hours that you've got, how your contract is structured, job design, occupational uncertainty, and then the respect and dignity that you're afforded. Those three things come together to form the real bulk of workplace well-being. And as Mary said, that's why discrimination or harassment in the workplace, when it plays into shame, is so important. But a lot of those things can be about training, can be about workplace policy, but it's not just down to the individual. Those are really things that come out of an organization that has thought through the kind of meat and potatoes of how their work is organized, and it's not just seen through it's not sort of a well-being 10% that's added at the end, because if you put sort of yoga classes on but you're doing 0 hours contract and having unreasonable requests on your staff on a consistent basis, it's just not going to it's not even going to touch the sides. So the most important thing are the way that we're structuring work fairly clearly and consistently. That makes a big difference to people's well-being at work.
I think that's a brilliant framework that many people on this in the audience can take away. And just as you're both talking, I was reflecting on a book that I'm listening to. I don't seem to find or make the time to read books. I seem to audible my books these days, and I'm still not 100% sure how much stays in. But this did stay in. I was reading or listening to a Jonathan Haidt book, and he quoted a study that just stuck with me. And the reason why I'm sharing that is I think there's relevance to accounting and finance people within the context they operate in, and when they're very, very busy, do they make different types of judgments when they're very busy and the context has changed? And you probably, maybe Mark, might have come across this study, but it's the study whereby, and I don't know exactly, I can't quite recall who did the study, but he quotes this where there's a priest going to a school to give a talk, and they say to one of the priests, you are 10 minutes late to give this talk to the kids, okay? And then they do that about 50 times, and then you get another priest and they do exactly the same situation, talk in a school and say to the priest, you're 10 minutes early, okay? All the priest has to do is walk from the entrance of the school to the class. What they do in both examples is they get the priest to walk past a man who's having a heart attack. And what was absolutely fascinating was when the priest thought he was late running to get to the class, what percentage of the time do we think the priest stopped to help the man having a heart attack? Basically hardly ever, right?
Wow.
Whereas when he said to the priest, you're early, the priest stopped every time. We like to think a priest would stop every time, I'm sure they would. But that context of feeling under pressure, so then you heighten the study even more, where they literally had the man fall to the priest's feet and he still kept walking because he thought he had to get to the class. And the reason why I'm sharing that, and it stuck with me, is when accounting and finance people on this call, we're up against audit deadlines. We have got decisions to make very quickly. We've got to report to the board. To what extent does that really shift the judgments that might be made? And how can accountants or professionals in general stay true to themselves and the judgments and the ethics that they need to make? So maybe Mary, you could give us a view on that first.
Yeah, for those who are listening, Jonathan Haidt, it's Haidt. He's got lots of really good stuff, really good chap to listen to. And the message I took away particularly from his work, is we come into this world predisposed to behave in certain ways. So some of us are more extrovert, some of us are more introverted. He's done lots of work with newborn babies up to the age of 12 weeks and so forth. And that's a really interesting starting point to think, so what do we do in the workplace? We identify ourselves, you're KPMG, I'm EY, we've got these dominant cultures. How does that fit with us as individuals? And one of the things I have on my desk is stress inhibits neuroplasticity. If I'm looking to grow and learn and take in things, I have a constant reminder that stress inhibits that. Therefore, it's up to me to manage the stress levels in my organization, to make sure that we're properly resourced, if we're on boards and things, to make sure we're properly resourced, to make sure that people are able to get time to think, and the example of the focus of, I've got to rush because, that as human beings, we filter out what we think is peripheral. And it's why I say pay attention to the outliers. You know, we can't afford to just all focus on the same thing, because that's where bad decisions are made.
Yeah. Mark, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. It's quite. I just say that I think we underestimate the importance of ethical practice. Like, do you understand what are your ethics? What are the ethics that you live by? What are the values? Have you nurtured them? Have you defined them? How important are they? And have you practiced them? Have you practiced them in the small ways? Have you been prepared? And I think it's a failure of the education system that we're not taught that we are ethical actors playing in the world, that we have a responsibility, and that we are really, you know, I think it's important, especially in the accountancy profession, to know you're going to be, you are going to be faced with ethical dilemmas, and they do that in other professions like medicine. But it's not realistic for us to be expected to be under pressure and act ethically unless we're prepared for it. I think we can, and I think there's lots of examples of great human decision making in the moment, but you tend to find that it's those who have done a bit of work in advance to prepare themselves and be ready, just like we do for physical training. And that you're prepared, you've worked your body, prepared it to respond in a particular way and to perform. I think that's so true. Somehow we don't think of it the same way in terms of ethical decision making, but we're ethical actors. We've got to know what we believe, and we've got to be ready and prepared to be able to put those ethics into practice and stand up for them. And I think that all starts in the small things that we do, Johnny, and understanding the value of that. So that would be my main message.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. And I want to remind the audience, if you'd like to submit a question, please do in the Q&A function. And a couple have come through. So I wonder if, I mean, I've got plenty more I'd love to cover with you both, but I wonder if we could switch to some of the audience questions for a moment, and please do keep them coming in. So John McLeod has asked a question, which is a quite profound question. You talk about staff being subject to organisational culture or groupthink, and therefore potentially not acting in accordance with their own code of ethics. However, what John is putting out there is that actually a lot of the unethical behaviour and in his opinion at the top level around mental health is actually around top executives trying to keep shareholders happy, the markets happy, and to keep their jobs. And that's where that judgmental piece is challenged. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe Mary, if you're happy to go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, it is just keeping that where are my responsibilities to stakeholders? So the whole discussion around, is it shareholder supremacy? Is it stakeholder supremacy? If it's all about what the shareholders want, then I'm just an actor in someone else's game. And that's where the cognitive dissonance comes in. I think the question from Graham on the views of duty of candour, freedom to speak up, those should be embedded in professions and should be embedded. There's things that we shouldn't need to legislate for. You know, if we've caused harm, which is what the duty of candour is about, if something we have done has caused harm, you know, as Mark says, we should admit it. We should speak up and say, you know, I am sorry, this has caused harm. Amy Edmondson's work, she starts her work from the premise of working in the health service in the US and saying doctors fared much better if they said to patients, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. They were much less likely to be sued. They're much less like people understand we're human beings. We're by and large trying our best. It's when we abrogate responsibility or we say, actually, I'm doing this because the shareholders are forcing me to do it. That's a hard position to respect.
Yeah, and I'd just say, I mean, I think there's a massive education piece. I mean, I hope I don't sound like a terribly naive charity sector executive, but I do think in the end, ethical behaviour is good for business success. But in the UK, at least, we do also have a health and safety executive who has a legal responsibility for health and safety, and that includes psychological safety and psychological toxins. So there is a regulatory environment which says there are some practices around stress that are that are not acceptable. Now, the problem with the HSE is that it hasn't been funded properly. The number of precautionary notices that it has offered to businesses acting and causing psychological harm are very, very low. And I was talking to the CIPD recently, who've just done an FOI on are they actually doing their duty, and because they've got such limited resource, they are not doing that. It's one of the policy recommendations that we're making to government, that they resource the HSE properly so that they can hold employers to account. So it's not just employees who have the responsibility to whistleblow, but actually the regulatory environment to be able to hold employers to account for not acting within the legal regulatory framework.
Mark, that nicely segues into a question that we've been asked actually around another framework in terms of ISO 45003. For those people that are less familiar with ISO 45003, it's the first global international standard providing practical guidelines for managing psychologically safe workplaces, health and safety in the workplace. And the person's asked, are there enough organisations using it? I'm not sure, Mark, or maybe start with you, Mark, how much you know about the data around that?
I don't know how many are using it. I just know the data on I know the data on workplace absence related to mental health. It's at a 15-year high in the UK, and we have about 149 million days lost to illness, and 52% of workplace illness and absence is related to mental ill health. And the bad news about that is that absence related to mental ill health is the longest of all absences. The average is about 22 to 23 days. So, you know, they use the frameworks, employers should be, but it's another reason that if you're acting with short-term interests and not protecting the mental health, the economic cost is absolutely huge. And so yeah, it's called the sickness absence paradox, that if you lose people to mental health, their mental health deteriorates being out of work, and therefore you make the problem worse. So I'm sure not enough organisations are using frameworks like that, but it comes back to my other point as well, that frameworks have to be enforced. There has to be carrot and stick. We've got to be tough about this. We can't just leave it in the nice to have box. We've got to be real that when people are being exposed to psychological toxins, there's a penalty for the organisation, not just for the individuals.
Mary?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally the role of regulators and professional bodies in dealing with the issues and not allowing a lawfare situation where one set of lawyers gets paid to argue the point with another set of lawyers for behaviour that nobody would think was acceptable. Why do we think it's acceptable then to pay lawyers to try to defend the indefensible? Why do lawyers think it's okay to defend the indefensible? Why do accountants pay lawyers to do this sort of stuff? I think we need some really grown-up conversations around what is going on in organisations, whistleblowing. You know, I talked with Flora Page, who's chair of the Institute for Business Ethics, and the crisis that we've got in whistleblowing, and that over 90% of whistleblowers are out of the job that they were in when they blew the whistle in the first place. They're out of the organisation. We live in a society where all of that is happening, and we're not, you know, this is where the Mental Health Awareness Week for me is really important, because there's a cost to society, there's a sustainability cost to our business reputations when we allow these things to happen. And it's people who are making these decisions. It's people making decisions about where their effort's going, where their money's going, where their priorities are.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because most people in this audience will be chartered accountants and who are required to report on all types of things within organizations, right? Whether it's on just generally the financial performance or risk or, you know, remuneration or playing into the broader sustainability space, for example. But given what you've just said there and some of the indicators, do you think at some point organisations, it'll become mandatory for them to report more broadly on their organisation's well-being in a much more structured, elevated fashion? I mean, there are various standards out there. There are various commitments. There are various voluntary codes, and different boards have chosen to adopt different things. But what's your thoughts on, is this something, or does this actually just become much more reporting? It becomes, a much greater burden, regulatory burden for organisations. Where do we get the right balance here?
If I take this morning's news about British Gas and the behaviour of suppliers and debt collectors working on behalf of British Gas to go and force prepaid meters in people's homes, we see our biggest companies accepting that they're going to be fined if these things happen. They're going to be fined. They're going to be big fines, £1 million fines. But we've reached a situation where that's taken as just part of the cost of doing business. I'm getting fined for non-performance, rather than actually a discussion around what must it have been like to have been a person with the bailiffs at the door, forcing entry to your house, forcing a prepaid meter when you're a vulnerable person. These are real business ethic things that are going on day and daily. And the question, I think the question about the ISO 45003, the question about duty of candour, these questions arise because of what people see day to day. The frameworks are there to help achieve something. But if the frameworks were working, we wouldn't have the Grenville Tower scandal, we wouldn't have the contaminated blood scandal, we wouldn't have the post office scandal. They don't happen because of lack of frameworks, they happen because people don't do the right thing.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you for that. So I'm looking at time, and we've got time maybe for another couple of questions, then we'll wrap up. So please do continue to post your questions in the Q&A. We've got two incredible experts here with Mary and Mark, so please do get your questions in. One, it's more of a comment than a question, but I think it's worthwhile raising, because for me, certainly in my experience on leading mental health and wellbeing strategies in large organisations, is that line managers are key in all of this, and whatever you're trying to drive. And the statement made is, I think line managers are key and require training to support their teams to become psychologically safe. What's again, maybe coming back to some of the practical things that people can do? Either you're a line manager or you report into a line manager that potentially you don't think is providing the right environment. Start with you, Mark. What's your thoughts around the importance of line managers and some tips we can give to the audience?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I'm on this independent review looking at the prevalence of poor mental health in England, and I'm on the workforce stream, and we did a review of the evidence of the most important factors, the most important variables, and line manager, the quality of the line manager is the biggest one. So that relationship makes the biggest difference in terms of your mental health and well-being. I think it helps if the structure of performance and accountability from the business perspective, from the organization's perspective, includes asking and checking in about well-being and training line managers in what to do in response to that. So being able to have a conversation as part of your performance review each month or whenever it is and ensuring that that takes place regularly and is recorded. I think that makes a big difference. I think if you're working with a line manager who you feel is toxic and that is damaging your mental health, I think, and that you don't feel safe in the workplace, the number one, the thing that we always say is the first step, if you can, is to raise it with the individual concern. Try to find a way to say, the heart of assertiveness is being able to say, this is what I need and this is what I'm not getting. When this happens, I feel like this. Can we find a different way of doing it? That kind of conversation, that kind of assertiveness is really important, and it starts the conversation, because they're obviously they're difficult conversations. And then then I think my other piece of advice would be don't wait too long without escalating it if that hasn't made a difference to somewhere else in the organisation, to the HR department or whistleblowing, because I think what people tend to do, and we see this time and time again, is they try and stick it out. They hope that it will get better, and it very rarely does. So it does need it. My number one advice, and it's hard. It just needs addressing. It needs tackling. And avoiding the issue is the one thing that makes it almost guaranteed to have a long-lasting impact on you.
And Mary?
I think the role of the board is really important. I see small companies, Colorado Construction is one that comes to mind immediately, where you're getting a constant messaging, and I have no connection with that company, but you get a constant messaging of it's okay to be not okay, that's coming from the directors on LinkedIn or whatever, posting these sorts of things. We've tried with the bigger companies to say we have to have a particular non-exec director with a particular focus on employee well-being. You look behind, why do these things come into play? They come into play because they're needed. People need a way to say, here is how I am able to feel confident about speaking up. But it's not just the systems and the processes, it's the behavior of the people at the top. Do you make it okay for people to say you're not okay?
Yeah, exactly. And with that in mind, there's a question that's just come through, and I'm at risk of asking this because we've got 2 minutes left, but I wonder I think there's actually an entire webinar around this question that's just come in, so maybe we can do a part 2 at some point. But the question is, there's a dichotomy between professional duties, in other words, entrusting the institute standards versus the organisation that pays your salary. Therefore, how do you bridge the two? Maybe just in a sentence or two, and then we'll wrap up. Mary, what's your thoughts on that? How do you bridge that professional, but ultimately, the agency and the moral hazard and all of this?
To thine own self be true. You're going to pay the price if you're not true to what you're being asked to do and where it sits within your frame of reference. So don't think because they're paying your salary, you're not paying the price. You're paying a considerable price. So one of the very sound pieces of advice I was given as a young professional is, as you age, you will judge more harshly decisions that you made when you were younger. So if you can be persuaded to compromise because you needed to pay the mortgage or whatever, when that imperative isn't there, you will be harsher on your own view of yourself and your behaviour in those circumstances. So I think we can't afford not to be true to ourselves.
Very profound. Mark?
I'm not sure I can add to that, but I do think it's the heart of the future of leadership, and integrity in the workplace in the end is a good guarantee of a long and successful career, and having confidence behind that, and not compromising. There is, using judgment, yes, not being reactive, yes, but in the end, as Mary said, preserving your integrity. And I think this should be the heart of, when I did an MBA, ethics was not part of it, and it should be the heart of accountancy training, of health training, and of those in commercial life. Yeah, it's really important, I think, for your professional satisfaction and your ongoing mental health.
Well, I think that is a perfect way to finish. And if I reflect back in the conversation, just finishing up there on paying your salary but paying the price, I mean, that's something I think people might be thinking about. And you're absolutely right, Mark, preserving those ethics and never lose your integrity in the workplace is fundamental. And if I think back to a couple of the things that will certainly stick with me, and I think I'm going to have to go back and watch this again, because there's so much content in here to really go away and assimilate. But that point you said, Mary, about 90% of whistleblowers not with the organisation, and also I quite liked the sentiment, but the point around stress and neuroplasticity, I think is a really good one to think about. And Mark, all of your insight around psychological safety, and actually even just the simplicity of your point that just get roles and responsibilities really clear, and what people are actually doing can make a big difference. So I'm hugely grateful and privileged to have been able to spend an hour with the two of you this afternoon on what is an incredibly important week, Mental Health Awareness Week, run by and led by the Mental Health Foundation. So thank you very much to our audience. You will receive an email after this with details, for example, of the helpline, for example, if you do want to speak to anybody about anything related to your mental health, as well as the recording of this session. But thank you very much, everybody.